So let's start by opening Visual Studio. We will create a new project. Just like before, we will be making a console app in the .NET framework with the C# language. So I'll hit next. And we will call this one functions and methods. And I'll click create. So we're back to our standard empty console application template. So before we go any further, we have already really been working with functions. So main is a function. It's the main function of our program. But also console.writeLine is a function. And console.readLine is also a function. And actually anywhere in these autocomplete boxes where you see this purple cube, they're essentially functions. They can also be called methods or procedures. They're essentially blocks of code that have a name and have a purpose. So, and actually, if you scroll through this list, it tells you some information about them. So console.read reads the next character from the standard input stream. So the input stream is just essentially it's the flashing cursor on your console application. You can actually go up and down this list and you can look at all these different functions and what they do. Read key obtains the next character or function key pressed by the user. And there is a lot of functions in here on our console object. So really, we've already been using functions that Microsoft had made for us. And these were all written by somebody somewhere. I think that's important to know, is like all of the framework was written by another person somewhere else, probably working for Microsoft. And we're able to write the same types of functions and the same types of objects in our own programs. So I think it's, well, people ask me when they're learning to code, like, where does all this stuff actually come from? Who put this here? And the answer for .NET Framework is almost always Microsoft. So today we're going to make some of our own functions. And the point of functions is to kind of keep you sane, really. You know, we've got this main function and we could put our entire program in here. We could put thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code in here full of if statements and, you know, tons and tons of logic. We could cram it all in here if we wanted to. And it would probably work, but if you ever had to modify it or share it with someone, it would be very unclear which block of code did what. And yeah, you could put comments in and try and make it as readable as possible, but really, that's not ideal. So what you might start to do is separate out different bits of code based on their purpose. So, for example, in a previous video, we put some conditional logic in to handle a command. Now, actually handling a command is kind of a function. You know, we're passing something in the command and we're expecting it to do something like, you know, speak to the user or perhaps perform a task in the background. So what we might actually do is create our own function called handle command. And the way we would do that is we'll type in static void handle command. And we'll open and close our parentheses. And we will add our braces on the end there. So that there's a lot going on here. So for now, you can ignore static. That's just something we'll cover in a later video, and it can be quite confusing. So I don't want to overload you. But void essentially means that this function we're building doesn't return anything. It returns a void, which is nothing, essentially. But you could have a function that returned a string, or you could have a function that returned an int. I know we haven't looked at numbers yet, but that'll become, you know, more prevalent later. But for now, we're going to make a function that doesn't return any object. It just does some stuff for us. And in order to handle a command, we need a parameter. So we've got this function, and we could call it from here. We could say handle command. And our program would start. It would see the handle command line. It would jump from there into these squiggly brackets here, and it would execute everything in here. The only problem is, once we're inside here, we need a command to actually handle. We could do console.readLine and receive a command, but then we're not just handling a command, we're sort of capturing a command as well. And that's like really, in logical terms, it's a separate job. So when you're making your functions, you should try and name them in a way which describes exactly what they do, and then try and avoid doing anything else in there. A lot of new programmers will have very poorly named functions or methods, and they'll start to grow and do tasks that they probably shouldn't be doing. And then when you come to want to make changes or change the way your application works, you then find that you've got to go in and modify lots of different commands that, on the surface perhaps don't necessarily need to be modified. So it's just something to keep in mind. So we've got our handle command function here, and we need it to receive a command to handle. So one thing you can do is create a function parameter. So we could say that we want a string as a parameter, and we'd like to give it a name of command. So this is essentially saying you must pass in a variable into this command, into this function, and we would like that variable to be called command, and it must be a string. Now you'll see here, now that I've added this string parameter, suddenly Visual Studio is telling me that this line of code is incorrect. And you can see in the error list down here at the bottom, there is no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter command. And what that's essentially saying is you can't call this function unless you give us a command to handle. And the way that we would do that is we would type in console.readline. Just like we have in other videos, we will ask the user to enter a line, and we will pass that line into the handle command. So now when we run our program, the program will pause because we're waiting for the user to enter a line. As soon as the user does enter the line, our handle command function will then be called, and we will be given the command in this is called scope. So within the scope of this function, we now have a command. So let's just tidy up the main function. So we would like to inform the user we would like a command, just like before. So we'll say console.writeLine. Please enter a command. And we'll end that with a semicolon as normal. We will then ask the user for a line of code, and we will hand that to the handle command function we've created below. And now essentially we could do some conditional logic like we did last time. So let's just say if command equals test, we will write a message on the screen, console.writeLine. We are now testing Captain. And if we go ahead and run that, actually, before we run that, we also need to put in a console.readline, stop our application closing. So I know I'm going through some of these bits very quick, but we've covered them in the previous videos in detail. So we always need a console.readline at the end of our main function if we want to have to wait for the user to hit return to close the application. We'll just quickly recap on this and then we'll run. So we've got, please enter a command. That's something we tell the user. We then wait for the user to input a command, and we pass that to our handle command function. Our handle command function receives that command via this string parameter here. And then we check to see if that command is equal to test. If it is, then we inform the captain that we are now testing. So let's just see how that plays out. I'll type in the test command. And we are now testing captain. So what you can see there is we've actually come out of our main function. We've done some work in our handle command function down here. And then that work is completed. So as soon as the end of that handle command function is hit, then we jump down into our main function again. And then finally we hit this console.readline, where if the user hits return, we then hit the end of our program and our program closes. So this is a very simple example of controlling not just the flow of the application, but organizing different functions and different features of the application into separate chunks of code. And you might find that this handle command code could be, could be used elsewhere. You might find that you check for a certain command, maybe a command that checks a database. And if the database value is is, not there or not as expected, you might actually call this handle command function again with a different command, like a backup command or a failsafe command. So having all of your code broken down into these bite-sized chunks allows you much more flexibility everywhere in your app, because you can call those functions from anywhere else. So what might be a good next step for you to practice making your own functions would be to set out a bunch of conditional logic for different types of commands. So something like, we might have test, we might have hello, like we had in a previous example, and try and put in maybe half a dozen of these. And then instead of writing to the console, you could farm out the task of these particular functions or commands into their own function. So we might have another static void, and this one might be called handle test. And it doesn't necessarily need a parameter, and we could just have the same console.writeLine in here. Say we are now testing captain, just like we did before. And then instead of having this line of code sit inside of that particular command, we could actually just reference the function. And then actually you'll see that we're jumping from main to handle command. We've worked out that it's a test command, and we'll say, right, we need to handle the test now. And I would just put a bunch of different commands in here with your conditional logic, and then farm them all out to their own function. That'll start you getting used to using functions. You should really use a function in your program whenever you're programming a feature or a behavior, or something that is doing something. Give that something a name and put it in a function, and then you can call it from anywhere.